Good evening and welcome to Bronx Talk. Tonight our guest is the Assembly member from the Bronx's 87th Assembly District, which includes the Bronx neighborhoods of Parkchester, Castle Hill, West Farms, and parts of Westchester Square. She is also the chair of the Puerto Rican Hispanic Task Force in Albany. We'll talk with her about that. We've also got the city of yes and congestion pricing on our list, and there are some plans for construction around the Cross Bronx that have raised some eyebrows that we will talk about. And because she's also a registered nurse in the oncology department at Montefiore Einstein Hospital, we have healthcare on our agenda tonight. Lots more. Let's get to it. Join me in welcoming the Assembly member from the 87th AD, the Honorable Karines Reyes. Assembly member, nice to have you.
Thanks for having me, Gary.
Let's just start off with your role as the chair of the Puerto Rican Hispanic Task Force in the Assembly. As you know, we've had a couple of your colleagues on here. They have expressed concern, I'm curious if you agree with it or not, that the Democratic Party kind of missed its message to Hispanics, and that's why many of them crossed over politically and voted for Donald Trump, both here and, of course, across the country. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think the Democratic Party, the national and the state party, have, in many ways, stopped talking to Latinos.
Really?
And we saw that in this election. I think part of it is that, but also part of it is, and I want to be careful, not to single out any specific group. I think Latinos are overrepresented in the Bronx because we are a large Latino borough.
56%
right?
Hispanic,
so,
majority Hispanic borough?
Correct. So, of course, when we see that shift, it's very easy to say it's Latinos who have crossed over to the Republican Party and were voting for Trump. But this is a trend that we saw across the nation, and it was predominantly men of a certain age, men that are young and without college education, who crossed over and are just frustrated by the state of affairs and the economy, and voted overwhelmingly for Trump. And I think irrespective of their ethnic identity, I think we need to be doing more to provide economic opportunities and educational opportunities for young men. And I think that overwhelmingly was the message in this election.
And they did not hear that from, I mean, this is already old news, but they didn't hear that from the Harris campaign.
No, they didn't.
Not as much.
I don't think they heard it as much from the Harris campaign. But the reality is, and I think an important statistic in that group is the fact that they didn't have a college education. And what we've seen in this economy is that if you don't have a college education, you're going to struggle. You're going to struggle. So, one of the things that I've been doing in my work in the legislature is to try and make CUNY free again. To really expand the opportunities for higher education for families. I'm a mom of a freshman in college. It is so expensive to send our kids to college, and families are struggling. And many young people are deciding that it's no longer affordable for them to do that, and families are deciding for that too. And if we want, I think, a society that's educated, that can compete not just in the economic market in this state and in this country, but in the globe, we need to prepare them.
When you talk about CUNY being free, this rings home to me. I'm a Lehman College graduate, class of 75. And when I went to college, it was, in essence, free.
Yeah.
And so basically, and folks may not understand this, but you would leave, let's say, junior high school, and you'd automatically get into a public high school.
Correct.
So when I left DeWitt Clinton High School, I automatically was admitted into a CUNY college. And then, of course, this is an old story, but they wanted to charge $75 for an activities fee. And we had a protest all along Goulden Avenue, people saying, no, you can't do that. What is the reality of that? I mean, the notion of having CUNY be free requires an enormous investment from the state, presumably. Is that a reality, or it's kind of the direction you'd like to go?
It's the direction we'd like to go. There was a huge hole blown in the state budget with the pausing of congestion pricing that now was restarted.
We'll talk about that in a moment.
But ultimately, it has a very high price tag. And I think it's also hard for people to come around the idea of it being free when you've never experienced higher education
Well, that's
being
why
free.
when you told me about it, it's firsthand.
My stepdad talks about, he was a Lehman graduate, and he came here for free, and he always used to tell me how, when I went to school it was free, and I think that's lost for a lot of our young people, and we would like to provide that opportunity for them again.
Interesting, and I think the sale, I wasn't planning to go in this direction, but I think the sale to the various powers that be that would have to look at it would say that the benefits strongly weigh the cost, because people would be more productive, you'd have less welfare and all those other services that you'd have to provide.
We have young people that are just frustrated. They're frustrated because they're really having a hard time getting ahead. And this economy is not like it used to be. You can't just go get a job and be able to provide for a family. That's not the reality.
Listen, community centers, I know I'm preaching to the choir on that. Let's just move ahead, though, because we could spend all the program talking about it. What do you hear from constituents who are immigrants now? Are they scared? Do you think you have many undocumented in your district? Just what is your look as we get after January 20th?
I know I have a lot of undocumented neighbors, and so does everybody, because that is the reality of not just New York City, New York State, but our country. And they are scared. They are scared because this incoming president is talking about just blanketed deportations. I think he said in an interview recently, his first television interview, he said, well, we want to keep families together. That may mean deporting parts of a family that are also U.S. citizens. I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding of immigration. I think people are playing on their fears on crime and violence. And is that a problem? Absolutely. I think we can address that without rounding people up. And history tells us that rounding people up is never a good idea.
And it's also going to be expensive, because in order to do it, not only do you need the legal, the
absolutely
crime, the infrastructure to do it, but then what do you do with the people as you're processing them? And
it's chaotic to just think about it. I know in practice it's going to be chaotic, but one of the things that I think is I think challenging that we should really pay attention to is that when we push people deeper into the shadows, it makes us less safe, right? We don't want our immigrant or undocumented neighbors to be afraid to go to the police and report a crime. We don't want them
to get work where they may be targeted,
right? Or to seek help for their children, or whatever it may be, or go to the hospital and seek care. That's not the kind of society we want to live in. So we don't want people living in fear. And ultimately, this is what's going to happen. People are going to live in fear.
I was thinking about the finances of the things we talked about, more money into ICE and more money into, creating some sort of holding place. I don't even want to think of what we might want to call them. If you took that money and spent that money in teaching citizenship, developing people who are undocumented, even with a workforce development of some sort, if necessary, you could probably, balance your budget, and then, of course, have more productive people. That's Gary's editorial.
Statistics have also shown that immigrants commit crimes at a much lower rate than U.S. citizens. The uptick in crime is not due to immigrants and migrants. I think, and I think it's also misleading when we have leadership in city government that says, our hands are tied because we're a sanctuary city. That is not true. The law absolutely allows them to detain and deport people who commit violent crimes. But what we don't want to do is criminalize everybody just for being here.
Just for being here. I do want to move ahead. City of Yes passed the city council. Let's see, the Bronx community boards that supported it were 4, 3, 9, and 7. Now 9 is yours.
Yeah.
Your thoughts about the City of Yes? Are you okay with it? Do you have concerns?
I mean,
I'll share what some of your colleagues have said here, but go ahead.
I mean, yes, with an asterisk, right? I think it's 80,000 units that they're trying to build over the course of 15 years. I think it's definitely not enough. I mean, we've done work in our legislative body and in my office to to allow the state to convert like office buildings and all of that into housing. We did that during the pandemic. I think that's a good idea. The key here, and I think this is going to be the caveat, is how affordable these units are.
I knew you were going there.
Yeah.
Well, you know, they did make an adjustment, and I'm learning about it, that if you add 20% height, those can be the affordable apartments. Not necessarily all those people have to live at the top floors, but those are the ones you can add as affordable. That doesn't mean that you're still not going to have apartments that are too expensive for regular people in the Bronx.
The cost of housing is through the roof. And we really need to build housing that is subsidized by the city and the state, that is deeply, deeply affordable. That should be our priority.
The one size fits all is what I've heard from your colleagues who have been here on the show, is that's problematic. And that certainly in all of our neighborhoods, in all of the little places in our neighborhoods, there is, there's a lot of room for all kinds of differences. I want to talk, speaking of housing, let's talk about Mitchell-Lama. Now, I mentioned to you that I do live in Mitchell-Lama, and I can tell you firsthand, our rents are going up, so that it won't be as affordable as it has been. And I know that you have some concerns about Mitchell-Lamas in your district, so
we have been working very hard on one of our Mitchell-Lama developments, which is Jamie Towers in the Castle Hill section of the Bronx. It is, Mitchell-Lamas, some of them are under HPD, some of them are under DHCR. That one happens to be a DHCR.
Which means it's a state project.
It is a state project, correct? And so the conversations that we've had, they've had multiple increases. I think a 14% increase last year, the previous year, and a nearly 40% increase the following year.
This sounds familiar to me, unfortunately.
And it's really becoming burdensome for families to stay there. When we have conversations with DHCR, they say that the program was not meant to be a place where people age in place. It was meant to be an entry point for middle-income families to be into home ownership. But it's not meant for seniors who age in place, because the reality is it's home ownership, and the cost of owning that property continues to go up, and that is difficult for people on a fixed income.
The other thing, now I don't know how old is Jamie Towers?
I don't remember off the
my
top
buildings
of my
are
head.
very old, and what I understood was, and maybe this fits right into what you were saying, is they had never anticipated that the buildings would be 50 years old or 60 years old. So now if they need new windows or new elevators, or the lobby is falling apart or whatever, there's no infrastructure money because it wasn't planned for at the beginning.
Correct.
Right?
And we've given money, capital dollars, to try and mitigate some of
the
that.
Assembly, or you individually?
Me individually, out of our own resources. We negotiated with the Assembly to give us a little bit of operating money, but there's like a tax burden that comes with that, and we've proposed to the city perhaps being more lenient and more flexible with the taxes that are charged on Mitchell-Lamas and co-ops and condos as well.
As one way of handling it.
Right. But ultimately, the capital improvements that you mentioned are what's really the big ticket item.
Fortunately or unfortunately, I do know a lot about it. I had been on the board of a Mitchell-Lama a little while back. Do you find that DHCR in and of itself is a problem? Because I know there were times that we would apply for loans, and then you'd wait months or even years to even get a response, and in that time, of course, costs are going up and you don't have the funds to pay for the various needs. Do you find that, or is that just isolated from my experience?
I think they're part of the problem. DHCR would tell us that for Mitchell-Lama is governed by the board, and they are not in a true oversight body. They're just there to provide guidance. What happens is that people people who serve on the board of these Mitchell-Lamas are people who work, don't have any building management experience, and they make these decisions. And Mitchell-Lama can be heavy-handed sometimes, particularly when they're imposing rent increases. But when the board needs true guidance, they're kind of hands-off. And I think that
That's
set of
interesting.
mixed messages is the problem. And we
So-
actually had a hearing recently where there was a lot of our neighbors who testified, and we heard this across the city and across the state.
That they could really use some advice. How do you recommend we get this done?
Correct.
Wow, that's a fascinating concept. A couple of other development things, then I want to talk about healthcare. You've got the Metro-North stop coming, right?
Yeah.
That's the Parkchester Van Ness station. That's the only one in your district.
Correct.
Are you satisfied with the plans? Do you like what you've heard?
Well, some of the road work, the road rail work already started. I think the station should be up and running by 2027. There has been transit-oriented development that's been proposed. Some folks in the community have, again, posed some concerns about the development. Again, I think affordability is our big concern. And in the Parkchester area, parking has always been such a headache.
Oh.
And
Sorry, that was a Bronx boy
we all kind of
reacting.
cringe.
Oh,
We
yeah,
all
I
kind of
get
cringe
that.
when we talk about parking in
Yeah, right,
Parkchester.
right.
We want to make sure that it's, that we don't burden residents with just more of the problem with the parking, the congestion, the traffic.
Do you think that the city has been? We had Dave Gorodnick here, and he talked about all the hearings and everything
Yeah.
else. Do you feel like those kinds of issues are being heard?
I think there are times when they really take our concerns seriously, and we've seen in some instances where their plans change based on some of the input that's come from the community.
More to do as it goes on.
Yeah,
is
we
what
have
I'm
to keep an
hearing.
eye on it. Yeah.
Speaking of development projects, I was not aware of this till I read a story in the paper, is that there's a project that the governor announced to redo bridges that need repair on the Cross Bronx.
Yeah.
But that will include construction around roadways, more cement in the Bronx. I mean, we know
Yeah.
what the implications are. Plus, my question is, how does that affect the ongoing effort to cap the Cross Bronx?
Right.
It's right in your district. It
Yeah.
runs right through the heart of the borough and of your district. What do you think?
Yeah, we've been fighting capping the Cross Bronx is one thing separate and apart from this. This project, from what the state DOT tells us, is to rehabilitate these 5 bridges that are crumbling, that kind of prop up the Cross Bronx Expressway and have to be touched. So when the community came to us with concerns, what we did is we organized all the stakeholders and elected officials in the Bronx. We sent a letter to the DOT to come talk to us about this project because we needed more information.
So they didn't do the kind of due diligence beforehand?
They
that should?
allegedly did, but it wasn't sufficient because we had all kinds of questions. And they came before us, and to their credit, they did make some concessions and some promises to, one, be more open with the conversation. They have to set up a website for the community to be able to provide input. But I think the biggest concern was this extender road. That when you look at the plans, it's parallel to the Cross Bronx. And to us, it just looks like an expansion of the Cross Bronx Expressway, which is absolutely not what we ever wanted.
The last
Right.
thing is like, what's on your list? This one is even below the last one.
Yes. So they did agree to allow the community to provide more input, to take that input seriously, and to keep them more informed of the plans as they move forward. One thing that they said to us when they met with us was that section is meant to detour traffic while they work on the 5 bridges.
But then they would keep it
But then
alive.
they would keep it, and then in some plans, original plans, they had it as a roadway for cars, and some they had it as a pedestrian walkway, and some they had it as a bus lane. There's no bus that runs that route, so I don't know what they're talking about.
Where actually is it? I don't know exactly which streets. Do you know offhand?
I can't tell you
put
off the top of my head the streets,
Okay.
but it would
It's
be
further
on the
east than, as I understand, than the ones that are closer to the bridge, right?
correct. It would be running west, actually, on the eastbound side of the Cross Bronx
The
Expressway.
eastbound side.
Yeah.
All right. Next time I don't go on the Cross Bronx, I'll take a look. Because we in the Bronx know not to go on there. Last development question on congestion pricing. Now the MTA is going to, this to me was very interesting. The whole idea of congestion pricing was to fund the MTA, yet of course recently announced that the MTA is raising their fare. I was like, well, wait a minute, wasn't that supposed to pay for this?
Well, the MTA uses fares to pay for operational costs. The congestion pricing plan was meant as bonding to make the capital improvement projects that the MTA needs to fund. One of which is, ours is approved already in the process. The elevator that we're getting in the Parkchester station was part of the previous 5-year capital plan. So the MTA needs this money to be able to bond for projects that they,
let me just add, you're not
prospectively.
the only elected official who's been on this show talking about the need to make accessible subway stations, elevated, all the subway stations.
Yeah, I mean, the trains need a lot of work. They're showing their age, and the accessibility is a big issue. The majority of New Yorkers ride public transit. The increase of the fare hikes is really for the operating costs, and a lot of people talk about, people who are fare beaters who don't pay their fare. These are literally two separate pots of money. One thing that we found very interesting is that...
Thanks for clearing that up, by the way. I was thinking, so one is infrastructure money and the other is operating money.
Correct.
Thank you. You could tell Gary's not a budget guy.
But, the Fair Fares program that goes through the City Council, one thing that we found recently is that about 40% of the people who qualify for Fair Fares actually don't apply for it. And instead, they just are beating the fare. So this would be perhaps the MTA and even us. We should be more proactive in getting people signed up for fair fares, because that pot of money is there that the MTA can be using for their operating dollars. Because ultimately they're taking a loss because people aren't paying their fares.
Sounds to me like you were disappointed in the governor when she decided to cancel it the first time around.
I think it was.
I don't want to prejudge it, but listening to you, that's what it sounds like.
Look, I think the congestion pricing program had been vetted. It had gone through all the channels. It was approved. It was slated to start. Were people going to be unhappy? Yes, but I think people oftentimes are unhappy with a lot of policy until behaviors change, right? And the idea of congestion pricing was to change behaviors for people who tend to drive into the city and relieve some of the congestion. I just think it was a bad political move in the middle of an election.
Although, of course, people said it was done for political reasons.
It gave a lot of room for people to speculate on political reasons.
And then she was kind of forced, given the results of the election, to come up.
Well, there was a huge hole in the budget if you stop it.
Are you concerned now that the difference between the $9 and $15 is still going to leave a hole in the budget, or we're still waiting to see?
Basic math tells us we're going to have to figure out where the money comes from.
Yeah, I even figured that out. This is something I've wanted to ask you for a long time, and then I had it confirmed by the people who work in your office. You still practice nursing?
Yeah.
You are an RN. I mentioned it at the top of the show.
Yeah.
And you, I'm sorry, I don't know how you do it.
I was working yesterday.
How does that inform your work? Like, do you learn more? Does it help your work as an assembly member?
I think,
to me, that's so interesting.
Absolutely.
And congratulations for doing that.
Thank you. It absolutely informs my work. I think in terms of healthcare policy, oftentimes we talk about health, home health, the discharge of patients, the bottleneck, new practices in medicine, new trial drugs. I do oncology, so we talk a lot about trial drugs and things like that. Health insurance and the payment of it, and
actually how it affects patients.
I see it in practice every day with the people I take care of.
How often do you work, if we can say?
Minimum twice a month.
Twice a month.
But oftentimes more than that.
Wow. I'm going to tell you a little anecdote that Freddie Ferrer was here many years ago, obviously, when he was borough president, and he had just come out of the hospital. He had been through surgery, and he said, and you're going to appreciate this, nurses are the best people in the world. So there you go.
I agree with him.
And do people around the hospital and even patients know who you are?
Yeah.
Or they do. They do.
A lot of my colleagues know who I am.
Do they blame you if something goes, where's the funding?
They like to stop me and talk politics sometimes. Like, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Sometimes my patients recognize me. I've had like some folks in that I go to the senior center and they happen to be hospitalized. They're like, oh, there you are.
Wow. There you go. You had a bill with New York State Senator Ramos that allowed New York State workers' mental injury claims to be reviewed by a New York State workers' comp.
Correct.
What was the problem you looked to solve, and do you think you got there?
So under the law, this benefit was extended to first responders, police officers, and firefighters. but we know that a lot of jobs can be stressful. We've seen shootings at supermarkets. We see shootings at in the train, and all those workers wouldn't qualify to be able to take time off,
Really?
or to be able to have their if they suffer from PTSD or depression because of
I
the
see.
event, that be covered by workers' compensation. This allows for all workers to be able to claim that benefit. And what the board used to do before was they would dismiss it automatically. This doesn't mean that everybody gets the benefit, but it means that the workers' compensation board can't automatically just
Wow.
dismiss it.
Well, congratulations. I mean,
Thank
every step is another good step. Just to wrap it up, what's the next session in Albany? What are you going to bang on the desk and say, this is what we're going to do in 2025? What is on your agenda?
I think, initially we work on the budget, first part of session. This is going to be a tough year, particularly we can anticipate that we have a federal government that's not a friend to New York or the Bronx.
So then you may have to figure out how to make do on some areas that you
Correct.
didn't have to fund before.
Correct. I think Medicaid is in danger. And in the Bronx, I think we have about 60% of residents have used some form of Medicaid. They're already talking about cuts to Medicaid, and I think people in the Bronx are going to feel it.
So that's the first thing, is just dealing with that. Are there other things you are concerned about? We already talked about the immigration situation with the federal government in your district, with the new presidency.
A lot of things, education, whoever, their health
Boy,
and
if you talk about
human services.
funding CUNY and funding public housing. I just read a story that people in public housing are more frustrated maybe than ever,
Correct.
which is
All of that
considerable.
comes from the federal government.
I'm aware.
So,
Well, we are thrilled that you joined us today,
you.
and we really hope you'll come back at some point.
Absolutely.
Maybe halfway through the year, and tell us how, or if all these things came true. I don't know. We'll see.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Karines Reyes from the 87th Assembly District. We appreciate it. We thank our producer, of course, Rebecca Hemick, Director Will Guzman, Urelis Encarnacion is on graphics, Ray Reyes on audio. The editor is Yenelsida Diaz. We have a cast of thousands here with us in the studio. And of course, to you too. You know, we love you, the people of the Bronx. So if the curtain don't fall and the creek don't rise, see you next week. Good night.